There we go. My computer has problems. Bad, bad. Yes, you can do it. Yes, no, I feel like that with my laptop sometimes, where I'm like, "Go, laptop, you got this." All right, Kate. Today we're talking about alternatives to prose. Now, the definition of prose being the classic, like she walks down the corridor, the wind whistling through it, or different things like that. Like you're just a way that is very normal and basic. So these are alternatives that are unique and not your average. So the first one we're going to talk about is letters. Now, can you write an entire story based on letters? Yes. Would I necessarily recommend it? No, purely because of the fact that that can get really boring really quickly if you're not having a lot of drama. However, if your story is a drama and the whole thing is so and so cheated on so and so, gasp, then you're fine. Like the letters will be sufficient because then people will just be like, my goodness, and then you'll be fine. Like, but if the crux of the story is fantasy or science fiction, I would say have some letters interjecting or have some letters that give intrigue at the beginning of the chapter or interrupt the chapter. That's totally fine. But if you're doing it entirely out of letters, we're missing all the action of the fantasy and the science fiction. And so as a result, it feels a lot more dry and not as intriguing. Um, we want to be immersed in that world, science fiction or fantasy, because of the fact that it is a new place. If it is just, New York in the 1920s and we're having two people fall in love and there's drama in New York, we know 1920s, we know that drama happens. Like, we don't need to see them enacting drama in order to be able to. So it's just a matter of what your context is. If you do, like I said, have letters interrupting though, or like at the beginning of a chapter, I know that Brandon Sanderson did this in the first Mistborn book, where he had these little almost like entries that were kind of letter-like at the beginning of each chapter. That's totally fine if you want to have it at the beginning of each chapter, at the end of each chapter, or even if you want to have the first chapter have a couple, all of a sudden it bursts into prose. That's fine, but for intense world building, we need prose. Prose is just essential for world building. Um, with letters, though, another alternative to this, branching off of that, as I was just saying with Mistborn, is diary entries. So, diary entries and letters are slightly different, though, because most of the time in letters you might be keeping, a secret from the person you're sending it to, or it might be a gossip letter, or different things like that. It typically has a connotation, even if it's just like, hi, Grandma, I'm having a terrible time here, or whatever. There's typically things that other person because we're people, right? We like our privacy. We don't just gush all of our secrets to a rando normally. Maybe there's a reason. Yes, unless this is your secret partner in crime, you probably don't want to say that. So, like, there are things you would be keeping secret, and that's what makes letters so hard and what makes prose interrupting it or continuing the narrative so essential most of the time. Unless, like I said, it is a drama. If it's a drama, perfectly acceptable because then they can just say like, "Oh my gosh, my sister! I can't believe it so and so cheated on me. Oh my goodness, my heart is torn in twain." And you don't need to like see that. You're like, "Oh my gosh, I feel her pain because I see it in her writing to her sister." It's kind of almost poetic because you're like, "Oh my goodness, this is crazy." Um, with diary entries, most people are a lot more vulnerable journal entries. This is very, very private because they're literally just spilling their guts onto it. And for theoretically, if anyone found it, for the whole world to read. Um, Obviously, you hope that doesn't happen, but can happen. Um, with that being said, it makes it so that it's a lot more narratively sound. It does lead to a lot more telling than showing, which can be tricky. But the thing with this is that you need to have that balance between the telling, which is just, he said, she said, etc., and the showing, which is, the wind flowed through her hair. Most people don't think like that or write like that, but you will need a little bit of that in order to make it more intriguing and feel more real, even if that's not what normal people do. That's the thing about fiction is that it is, well, fiction. And so even if realistic things sometimes their reactions to it aren't as real or don't feel as concrete because of the fact that we're having to make it more interesting to the reader. with diary entries, you won't write it the same way you would write an actual diary. You'd more than likely add a few scenes in there where it's like the crisp wind bit into my skin, and it's like, would anyone talk like that? Probably not. Um, but are you going to talk like that for the sake of developing the scene? Yes. Um, and so that can really help. Can you do that with letters? Yes, but again, it's even less likely that people will talk like that. Unlike diary entries, it's possible people would talk like that. And so it's more likely that you can sneak that in there and people won't notice. With diary entries, you can just write the entire thing in diary entries. And the beauty of this is then you can do time skips of being like, oh my goodness, I've been so busy, I haven't thought to write in 5 months. And then it feels natural instead of being like 5 months later in the middle of a novel. Most people don't do that because it's considered like weird. But in a diary, you can totally do that because it's just like, guess what? I forgot. Like, and that feels much more human. Whereas the writer just being like, I'm too lazy to write the next 5 months, feels a lot more weird. I wanted those 5 months. Excuse you. Like, that felt important. Why didn't you just skip to a new book? Why don't you? Like, people have passionate opinions on large time skips. And for good reason. Normally it's because they feel like things happened in that time. Now, can you make it comedic or things like that and make it obvious that things didn't happen? Sure. I actually even just watched a TV show recently that made fun of that, where it was like, here's the moment when they first met, and it's like this rom com, and then all of a sudden it's like, and now we're skipping 5 months because nothing happened because they were both too shy to admit. Now we're moving on. Okay, that kind of works because we're like, oh, okay, so that was actually super boring, and we're skipping the boring bit to the more interesting bits. Um, and you can acknowledge that sometimes, but it is harder to do. Whereas with diary entries, you can just be like, guess what? That was boring. Skip. um, the next thing that we're going to talk about is poetry. Now, the difference between prose is how emotional and purple it gets. Now, I'm going to use the word purple because it sounds weird, but I'm going to explain what that means. There is purple prose. You may have heard of this before. Purple prose is something that you actually want to avoid, believe it or not. You want your reader to be immersed and have a lot of description, but once you start to reach into the quote unquote purple prose category, that's when it becomes so descriptive that you're like, and the bush is, has bright red leaves. And it's like, bush. This is page 3 of the bush. Like, ah. So. Yep, yep. Yep. Like, we've already established. Like, yes. It's like, this doesn't matter. What? But yes, oftentimes that happened in older novels just because of the fact that purple prose was almost more wanted because of the fact that people were so bored. But now we live in a society where everything's happening so fast and you have to read all these books and all these TV shows and all these and so as a result, people actually hate purple prose now because they're like, get to the point. And so as a result, you actually want to avoid purple prose. But also, if you avoid it too much, then people are like, you want to hit that fine line of immersion versus I'm bored, there's too much description. When you hit too much description, you actually can breach into the poetic category. Also, the other thing that you want to keep in mind with poetry is often if they're in stanzas. If you are automatically writing it in stanzas, and I mean stanzas, not paragraphs, stanzas are typically like 3 sentences or less, whereas paragraphs are typically 5 sentences or more. If you're writing it in a stanza and then having these individual stanzas, it's poetry. It's no longer prose. I know that can be confusing, but they're two different things. And then you're welcome to go more purpley because the point of poetry is to richly describe a scene. That is the whole point, is to be as purple prosy as you want. So if you are having trouble with purple prose, you may actually want to just experiment with moving into poetry. And there's nothing wrong with doing narrative poetry. There's actually a lot of books that are written in narrative poetry. Heck, the Odyssey was originally written in narrative poetry. The Iliad was originally written in narrative poetry. 99% of most Greek and Roman texts are actually narrative poetry, not prose. They purple, flowery, gushy stuff. Um, and stuff where they were like, oh my gosh, for 5 pages we're going to talk about this crazy event. And we're like, wow. Floor, just All right. But yes, it can be fun though. I have to admit, the Greeks talk about most of the time, most of the time they focused on the narrative, and so even though it got purple, it worked because of the fact that it still stayed true to the soul of the story, the soul of the person it was following. Like with Odysseus, it talked he missed his wife, how much he wanted to go home. And so, as a result, it was much more compelling to read all this description because you just wanted to see if he got home. It made you much more on the edge of your seat where you're like, I want to see, I will stick through any amount of purple prose to get there. Um, and then same thing with the Iliad, where it goes back and forth actually between the two main characters. You know, the guy who's on the side of trying to breach into Troy, and then the guy who's on the side with Helen and whatnot. And it's actually this dichotomy of like whose love is stronger, the one who's trying to win it back for the sake of his king, or the guy who literally just met this girl a couple days ago. Like kind of the debate of is first love at first sight real, or this like relationship developed over years and years and years more real. And it had that dichotomy, and so more intriguing as people were like vying for one side or the other, almost kind of that classic like who's gonna win kind of scenario. We're invested. So with poetry, if you decide to write a novel in, just make sure that you have a sole character that people can get really invested into. You need that investment of heart and soul of that story, of someone who they can just grip onto and not let go. All right, next thing, dialogue only. Now, this can be also really helpful if you're writing things like graphic novels or comics or screenplays, because 99% of that is going to be writing really crisp, good. Because if your dialogue is dead, so's your movie, so's your comic, so's your graphic novel, fill in the blank. Because these things thrive off of the dialogue. Yes, the art is beautiful. Yes, the art is riveting. But without that dialogue, the story doesn't move. Um, with that being said, you want to make sure that you avoid one thing first of all, maiden butler dialogue. This is where you say things that the characters should already know. This has happened a lot in 1950s movies because they liked to over explain. So they'd be like, as you know, the master is coming home at 6 o'clock. It's like, why are you telling me this if I already know, you weirdo? You don't want to do that where they're just obviously saying things the others. It's much more intriguing if you actually, instead of spoon feeding it to them, just be like, hurry, the master's coming, or something like that. Then you're like, oh, cool. I'm like intrigued. There's action going on. Why are they so freaked out about it? Like, what's going on? It makes the reader want to hold on a lot more, especially as they're following the art. And it makes it a lot easier too for you as the artist because then you can keep the same panel with slight changes, so you have to do less work. Then you don't have to re-describe a whole new backstory or a whole like dramatic where they like turn around or something like that. You can just have the two of them staring at each other and like move a hand into the frame, move a hand out of the frame. Then it feels like they're moving organically, even though it's literally the same picture with a hand added. But the dialogue is intriguing enough that it feels natural, it feels organic. Um, with dialogue, you actually don't want to add a lot of likes, other pauses, because of the fact that even though these are natural in speech, uh, as you've noticed with me, it doesn't feel as organic to have a bunch of uhs and ums in regular dialogue because we just want to get to the point. And so we've actually cut a lot of those out of really crisp dialogue. Regardless of whether or not those actually should be cut out, it is such as the case. Um, and so I find that when writing dialogue, it's also good to establish things that are more emotional. And this is when you can have really great monologues, like in Hamlet or other things like that, or Macbeth, where they talk about things out loud to themselves. Because of the fact that, for the sake of drama, you can also have moments where people are talking aloud to themselves. Some people do talk aloud to themselves. I talk aloud to myself. Exactly. A lot of people do. And so it's having these dramatic monologues actually works a lot better than people think it does. A lot of people thought it was just a plot device, but a lot of people actually talk out loud, especially when it's dramatic or hard or emotional. And so you can really dive deep into their character in those moments as well. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is prose only. Now, this rarely happens, but sometimes it can happen if you're in a scenario kind of like The Quiet Place or different things like that, where it's like you literally cannot speak or you will die. And so you have to develop all these things through actions. And there's always that old adage that actions speak louder than words, but they typically do, which is a little sad because sometimes people can say like, I'm sorry, I really wanted to be there, but they're not, and then someone gets really offended because they're like, but you're not there. It doesn't matter. And so that's why prose only can work, even if you have two characters who are mute or have two characters who cannot speak. It makes it so that you can dive really deep into what actions really mean, what actions really say to one another, and do actions speak loud enough to be words? Does someone helping someone else really mean that, or do they think they're just helping them so that way they can better survive? Like, what does that mean? It's kind of like, even though Hunger Games is not a prose only novel, this is a great example of actions speaking louder than words, where a lot of the things Katniss did with Peeta were in the name of surviving, and yet he felt that they were in the name of love. And so those misinterpretations are going to be key to your prose only stuff because there is no talking going on. She was able to clarify things. They were able to clarify things using words, but if you don't have words to clarify things, you just have to guess based on your own dang thoughts. And you can have a lot more of that inner monologue as well, which can really thrive on that. All right, last two. List form. So with list form, this can typically tell a story in the form of a list. So you could do a bucket list, like, hey, these are all the things I wanted to do, or different things like that. Typically, you want to also interrupt this with prose um, using like bucket list number one, and then you'll have a whole chapter about bucket list point number one, or things like that. But you can also just do a list where it says like, these are all the things I plan to do to win him over, and then have little side notes on the side being like, this didn't work at all, or different things like that. And then it kind of tells a short story. This is better for short story narratives because of the fact that you can be taken on this roller coaster ride. With this, though, once again, you want to get rid of the actual normalcy of lists. Most lists have random things like buy toilet paper, and you want to get rid of those things. You want to just hit only the plot points. Yes, question?
Mostly, mostly a comment, but
Yeah, shoot,
so
comments are good too.
I was reading this one book, and
Yeah.
I remember that
Mm-hmm.
exactly because there was like this one at the very start of the chapter. It was
Mm-hmm.
like things that this character is afraid of, which is basically like
Yeah.
it gave all these lists, and it was
Yes.
like building that character is very afraid, but then they like do this brave thing at the end of the chapter, and you're like, no way,
Right?
so
It can help build character really, really well in a surprising way. Normally, it takes oodles and oodles of words in order to be able to describe and make a character feel real. And yet, lists of things can actually make us feel more real because we as people can generally create lists. Like, they'll do that for get to know you activities sometimes, where they'll be like, hey, everyone write a list of everything you're afraid of, or hey, everyone write lists of what you want to do when you grow up, or, different things like that. And that can actually really well define a person. And so, if you wanted to do a short story in the form of a list, you absolutely can. Just make sure that, like I said, it hits only the plot points. Or in this case, you have prose that follows it up, where you say, like, here's all the things they're afraid of. Now watch them do something brave. And you're like, holy crap, it means so much more because we saw all the things they're afraid of. That's a great example. Um, so lists are more meant to highlight, or like I said, they need to be more clean and clear cut. All right, last thing that we're going to talk about is nonlinear storytelling. So examples of this are things like reverse storytelling, where you start at the end and then you're like, so I have amnesia. I don't know what just happened. Let's try to piece it all back together. That's a classic one. Yes, question.
Is it like one of those moments where the main character is like, "Hi, this is me. You're probably wondering how I got
Yes, you
here."
can do that too. Yes, so you can go backwards where they start at the end and then try to figure out what happened, or you can start with a scene and they're like, you're probably wondering why it falling from the sky. Like Megamind's a great example of that. Exactly. And then all of a sudden they go backwards, and then he's telling the story in the beginning, and then it catches up to present, and then it kind of stops telling the story, and then it goes back to telling the story. And so nonlinear can actually be really helpful for grabbing people's attention too, because of the fact that sometimes you start the story really slow because you have to in order to build the world, in order to build the characters. But if you start too slow, we're bored. And so as a result, you need to be able to continue forward and have us on the edge of our seats. What better way to do that? Be like, hey, in 4 chapters they're gonna die, so keep reading. It's like, what? um, and or you can do things where it's non-linear in the regard that you start in the middle. And you're like, hey, I'm going to start in the middle of this and I'm going to tell you all that's going on. And then you flip flop between the beginning and then the middle. And so you kind of do past and present, 4 hours earlier, present, 5 hours earlier, present, that kind of stuff. That can be really fun just for the sake of, again, keeping us interested and wanting to keep reading or watching or consuming said media material. Yes, question.
How do you do time skips without it being like disorienting?
Excellent question. So, time skips without being disorienting. There's two things that you can do. One, you can do the classic it's all a memory kind of thing. And in those cases, you kind of have to melt it together. So you have a sentence that kind of smoothly moves you into the next paragraph. Um, so, for example, you could have them. I actually just read a story that did a fantastic job of this for the story contest, funnily enough, where he had them sitting in the rain at a funeral, and then it would be like, and then the raindrops melted into tears as I remembered this specific night, or different things like that. And so you're like, oh, why is he crying? What's this past thing? And so it makes you intrigued and it feels really natural. Then the other thing that you can do is you can also just literally state times where you'll say like 4 hours earlier, and then you just move. You just move on. You just say, guess what? Figure it out. Like, so you can either be really jarring like that, or you can be really smooth and poetic, like the first example. And if you're doing the smooth poetic example, just make sure you make it clear as you say, like, as another memory came upon me, or something like that. Like, you have to actually use the word memory, otherwise, people will be like, where am I?
Yeah.
So, those are the main two things. It's just make sure if you're doing a smooth transitioning sentence that it has the word memory, or it has the word as I remembered 4 hours earlier, or fill in the blank type of time thing. And then if you're doing it jarringly, just do the three asterisks, say how much time has passed, and move on. So, and the three asterisks is important just because if you are going to get professionally published, they prefer the three centered asterisks because then they can put whatever fun little thing they want in there once they publish it. If you do like crowns or something like that, they're going to get annoyed because they're like, what if we don't want to do crowns? Publishers get a little needy that way. They want to be in control. And so if you give them free reign by giving them three centered asterisks, they're like, we can make it crowns, and that would be cool, wouldn't it? But if you make it crowns, they're like, I don't like it because I didn't come up with it. They get salty. Not to like, sorry, publishers can get a little needy. They like to be in charge. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be in charge, but sometimes they're a little much, which is why you just give them free reign and then you pull them back in and say, what if compromise? Instead of being like, I'm in charge here, they'll be like, nope, we're going to drop you like a hot potato. So they have issues. Which is why a lot of people choose to self-publish these days. But as we all have discussed before, self-marketing is incredibly hard. So if you're not into marketing, maybe don't. It's 6 of one half dozen the other. Either you have less control or you have to do all marketing yourself, and social media is a nightmare. Yay. So yeah. Um, with that being said, you can also do the last thing I'm going to talk about with nonlinear is a braided narrative. This is actually a common nonfiction narrative. I don't know why it's so much more common in nonfiction. I think it would make great fiction, and I've only seen fiction novels do it. Kind of weird. But the idea is that you have all blending together as different narratives. Now, the reason you don't make this confusing is you just make it very clear, like 1983, 1985, present, or whatever. And then that way you can weave them together. And what you do is you pick three purposely contrasting narratives. So you can pick something like, hey, this is me when I was super like having a hard time because so and so passed away. This is me when I'm starting to get over it. And this is me perfectly like feeling great and doing awesome things now. And then you can see that progression as the story is woven together and you see all these different highlights. You can also do this with dual perspective. where you can weave two dual perspectives together, where you can have someone who's like, hey, I'm really struggling with this XYZ thing, and the other person's like, I'm having a great time. And you can, again, have these two things mirror each other or anti mirror each other, and therefore give a more interesting narrative. All right. Any other questions, or are we bored of me talking and just want me to shut up?
It's not boring.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad it's not boring. Are we good though? Okay, cool. I'm glad it's not boring though. It's hard to tell when I'm mostly doing the one talking. All right. So, as I mentioned earlier to you guys, but because I want to do so for the recording, we have the Spring Fantasy Contest coming up, which is write a your own original myth involving or about springtime. When I say involving, it just needs to take place during spring at the bare minimum. And when I say myth, I just mean it obviously has to be fantasy. Those are your two things. Has to take place during spring, has to be mythologic quality too. Where, like, if it takes place during spring, it's the myth of how rivers were invented, but taking place in spring, or different things like that. So it has to be the myth of something, whether it's something being created or two gods falling in love or something like that. It does have to have mythic like qualities. Um, and then the summer one, which is just unearthing bones of any type, somehow involved intrinsically in the plot. With those, the summer one isn't due until I believe the end of July, and the spring fantasy one isn't due until the end of May, I believe. So you have lots of time. In that case, I will turn the video off, and then y'all can ask any other questions about other stuff if you wish. Okay, button.